And that gospel reading comes from the Gospel of John, where we do read, "On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.' And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come.' His mother said to his servants, 'Do whatever he tells you.' Now, standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to them, 'Fill the jars with water.' And they filled them to the brim. He said to them, 'Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward.' So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, 'Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now.' Jesus did this, the first of his sign, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him." Let us pray. May your words only be spoken, O Lord, and your words only heard. And we do ask this all for your love's precious sake. Amen. Please be seated. I think most of you know that, I expect all of you know that David Bowie died last week. Actually, some of our folks, I asked one of our younger parishioners this morning as she walked in if she knew who David Bowie was, and she said no. So if you don't know who David Bowie was, he was a rock singer, and he died last week. David Bowie was also a very interesting person because he was very well read, and he thought very deeply about a lot of things in life, which I think in many ways was why he felt so profoundly alienated from the world around him. He read, for instance, Nietzsche's Gay Science, and in this this philosophical work by Nietzsche, this is the one where Nietzsche said, "God is dead." And he read many of the works of the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, we came to think that only things could be known with your 5 senses can be known. And so science, as well as philosophy, sort of pushed God out of the scene and said, there's no room for God. And then he read the works of Freud, and in the works of Freud, Freud talks sort of about the person inside the person, the subconscious that often drives things. And so the person that we think we are may not be the person that we really are. And so David Bowie concluded, he said, when we come into the 20th century, what we see is that everything we thought we ever knew is wrong. Now, you may not agree with that, but listen to where he goes with this. He says, and because everything is wrong, everything we knew is wrong, the 20th century for us was a blank slate. We became the gods ourselves. We became gods. And he said, and the very best we could do, and now this is his exact quote, he said, the very best we could do when we had to stand in and make morality for ourselves, the very best we could do was create the bomb. And so he looks at that and he says, we lost our fix in the chaos. He said, we are living with the repercussions of that still to this day. The chaos that comes from having to make our own morality, and the very best we can do is create a nuclear bomb. He said, we're living with the chaos that's created to this day. And he said, frankly, and again, exact words, we have no spiritual lives to speak of. And the chaos that's resulted, we have no spiritual lives to speak of, because a spiritual life requires some sense of order, not chaos, some sort of meaning, not being just simply adrift out in space. And so what I want to talk about this morning, what I want to ask you, and what I'd encourage you to ask me is, how's your spiritual life? How's your spiritual life? Do you have one? Do I have one? And that's one of those questions that I don't ask to make anybody feel ashamed or to make anybody feel uncomfortable, but just to be honest with ourselves. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with myself. And believe me, I'm not talking at you. I'm talking with you. And it may surprise you to know this, but as a priest, I often struggle with my spiritual life. I really do. There are so many things, so many tangible things I have to do in a day, in a week, and people will know if I don't do those things, that frankly, my spiritual life often takes a back seat. And I'll tell you, much to my disappointment with myself, sometimes I don't have a spiritual life. So, so how is your spiritual life? And the thing is, I think for a great many people in our day and age, they think that a spiritual life is irrelevant because they think spirit is irrelevant. We live in a tangible world, and the tangible world is important, and the tangible world is what's busy. Again, what we can know is what we know with our five senses. That, by the way, is a branch of philosophy called logical positivism. It was developed by a guy by the name of A.J. Ayer. It still shapes so many people's thinking this day and age. I heard A.J. Ayer speak at the end of his life, and at the end of his life, he said, I was wrong. He said, I was wrong. And somebody said, well, how do you live with yourself knowing you devoted yourself to a philosophy that was dead wrong? And he said, I hope I've given people cause to think. He was British in the words he actually used, where I hope I've given people woolly uplift. But this sense of logical positivism, that all we can know is what we can know through our five senses, all we can know is what we can know through science, is still very much with us today. It's the young person who says, I don't believe in God because science tells me there's not a God. See, that's the vestige of logical positivism, of philosophy, not science at all. And so for a lot of people, spirit, we don't even know if there is a spirit. We don't think there is a spirit, and so spirit's irrelevant. Who cares? We got the real world to deal with. And then even for those of us who call ourselves Christians, those of us who have spiritual lives, maybe we call ourselves Jewish or Muslims or whatever it may be, who have a spiritual life, very often we still live like atheists. We still live like people who don't have a spiritual life because, again, we just get so busy. We get so caught up in the things we have to do that this idea of a spiritual life takes a backseat. It just doesn't seem like it's really all that important. And so in the course of any day, we may or may not talk to God at all. We may or may not reflect on God's presence at all. We may or may not be guided by God at all. And so even those of us who, on one hand, would say we have a spiritual life, it's very important to us, we may not have much of a spiritual life at all. Our spiritual life may not be going very well at all. And so I want to suggest a different word. I want to suggest a different word than spirit, because these two words are actually synonymous words. And I want to suggest that what the spiritual life is really about is not so much about living with spirit, because who knows what spirit is? How do you live with spirit? I mean, but it's about living with heart. It's about living with great heart. One of the ways that this is sometimes said in our day and age is living with a whole heart. And when we talk about wholehearted living, when we talk about living with great heart, we're not talking about a person who goes to the gym and does cardio, right? We're not talking about a person who spends a lot of time on a Stairmaster, because we're not talking about the physical organ in here, are we? We're talking about something intangible, incorporate, something that is not physical, something that goes beyond the five senses. We're talking about spirit. Now, we might use the word heart, but in fact, and I did this while I was writing this sermon, if you, I guess it would be left-clicked in Windows Word on heart, the first synonym that'll come up for heart is spirit. So what's a spiritual life about? The spiritual life is about learning to live with great heart. The spiritual life is about learning to live a wholehearted life. And in the end, really, what's more important? Something that tells you how things work, or something that helps you to live with great heart? Right? And so we live this day and age. It's so caught up in the one, but neglects the other. And we're in this series about being happy. No one is ever happy who neglects the heart. I mean, right? There's no happiness if we neglect the heart. And so what becomes really interesting is this is precisely what Jesus taught. And I think one of the saddest things about our day and age is that people have sort of lost sight of Jesus. People forget Jesus. We become enamored with other teachers, other philosophers, other religious figures. But the problem is most times people aren't interacting with Jesus. They're interacting with what somebody else has said about Jesus. They're interacting with what a preacher said about Jesus, what a certain religion said about Jesus. And what Jesus himself said gets lost. And so often what Jesus said is far more compelling than what anybody else says about Jesus. And so when you look at the teaching of Jesus, Jesus teaches that the spiritual life is all about heart. This is, before Brene Brown ever said it. Jesus says the spiritual life is the wholehearted way. As helpful as Brene Brown is, and she's been very helpful to me personally. And so, for instance, in the book of Matthew, in the 22nd chapter, that's the first book in the New Testament, a guy comes up to Jesus and Jesus, I understand you speak for God, and so in God's eyes, what's the most important thing of all things? And anybody who's been at St. Matthew's has heard this before. This is sort of at the core of all we do at St. Matthew's. And Jesus says, what's the most important thing of all things? The most important thing of all things is to love. L-O-V-E, love. And we can imagine the guy saying something, wait a second, Jesus, that's not what I meant. I was looking for a command. You know, do this, don't do that. I was kind of looking for, because I thought that's what religion's all about. Religion's about all this stuff we're not supposed to do, right? I was thinking that you would say that the most important thing I do is I have to be in temple on Saturday, because that's what religion's all about, right? It's about the rituals that we go through, and Jesus says, no, you heard me right. You know, the most important thing is love, and then he says it's love the Lord your God with your whole heart. So there's that idea of it. And then the second commandment is like to it. So the second commandment, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. It's to love your neighbor with your whole heart. So what is it? What's the most important thing to Jesus Christ? To love with our whole heart. To develop a spiritual life that connects us to God. If you're uncomfortable with the word God, think of it like this. Think of it as like the grain of the universe. All right? It's a phrase from Stanley Hauerwas, a great thinker of our day and age. He talks about the grain of the universe. When we live life with a whole heart, our heart connects us to something bigger than ourselves. I believe that's God, but if you're uncomfortable with that, just think of the grain of the universe. When we're connected with our whole heart to whatever it is that's bigger than ours, we go with the grain of the universe. And the alternative is to rail against the universe, to go against the grain of the universe. And I just guarantee you, if you want the single greatest source of misery, it's to go against the grain of the universe. The universe will win every time. And our heart then connects us to other people, and there is no happiness when we're at war with the people around us, right? And so there's this idea of living with our whole hearts. And just to develop this one step further, I'd like you to take your Bibles out of your pew. So they're going to be the black book. There's going to be probably a blue book, a maroon book, but the Bible is the black book. Oh, yeah, maybe not everybody has Bibles. Well, for those of you who do, and if you may have, thanks, folks passing them back, that's great, and then we can look on at the people around us. We are going to look at Matthew. Matthew is about 2/3 of the way through the Bible. It's the first book of the New Testament. There was a guy named Matthew, one of the people who followed Jesus. He wrote this book. And we're going to look at the very end of Matthew 7. That's going to be, it doesn't help you a whole lot, but it's page 6, which is towards the back, because it restarts over. It would be... So if you look at my Bible, it's about this far through, okay? It's going to be towards the back. If you see like Luke, John, Acts, Romans, you're too far. If you see a whole bunch of old prophetic names like Malachi, Zechariah, Joel, you haven't gone far enough. All right? So that's Matthew. Matthew 7. Jesus is, and this is Jesus, and this is what I mean. A lot of people read about Jesus, take other people's words for Jesus, but I want you to hear what Jesus says about a spiritual life. All right? So this is straight Jesus, and we're going to start at 24, and Jesus says this, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise person who builds his house on the rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew, beat on that house. It did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish person who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew, beat against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Now, what's a storm? Well, in the ancient world, a storm was something people couldn't control. It was fearsome. It was bigger than they were. It was an expression of judgment. And so it was this idea that one day we all come to the place of judgment. You might believe it's before God. You might believe it's before ourselves on our dying bed when we have to come to grips with the life that we did or did not lead. But one day or another, we all come to a day of judgment. We come to many days of judgment throughout our whole life long, and you know that as well as I do. And Jesus is talking about what gets us through that day of judgment, what allows us to go with the grain of the universe, if you will, what allows us to be connected to the people around us, what enables us to live with whole heart. That's what he's talking about here. And so, again, look at what he says, 24, and because this is just so important. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them. So he doesn't say the person who hears these words of mine and says, oh, that's great. Jesus, man, you really get it. He doesn't say the person who says, oh, I need my wife to be here. She needs to really hear this. He doesn't even say, and I know this is radical, he doesn't even say the person who hears these words of mine and says a prayer. Jesus, I want to follow you the rest of my life. He doesn't even say that. the thing that he says gets a person through the day of judgment, the day where we have to look at how well we have or have not done, whether before God or before ourselves, that loving the people around us is whether we've done the things that Jesus taught us to do, which is to love one another. In the end, that's what it comes down to, whether we've lived with whole heart. Jesus never asked anybody to be a Christian. He asked people to follow him in the wholehearted way. And if you turn back just to the page before, turn back one page, and there's these big, bold headings. And so when Jesus is talking about the things he wants people to do, look at the kind of things he's talking about. He's talking about adultery. Now, he doesn't want people to do that. I'll just clarify that right off the bat. But he's talking about, just look at the headings: adultery, divorce, oaths, keeping your word. I need to put my retaliation, loving your enemies. On to chapter 6, almsgiving, giving to the poor. Going on to page 5, he talks about where our heart is. He talks about worry, because if we worry, we're not able to love others. We're just all consumed with our own worries. Chapter 7, he talks about judging others. And you go on, you see the golden rule. And so what Jesus talks about, again, over and over and over, look at how much of that's relational. All those things are relational. They're about living with heart. So for Jesus, the way that you go with the grain of the universe, the way that you make peace with God, if you will, the way that we're connected to something bigger than ourselves, and through that, the way that we're connected with each other is that we live with our whole heart and we love one another the way that he showed us to love one another, the way that he taught. We follow Jesus. And what does that look like? Well, you know, interestingly, and I'm wrapping it all up with this. We have just a couple more minutes to go. For David Bowie, this is fascinating. David Bowie, towards the end of his life, after about 2004, nobody saw much of David Bowie. He just sort of went and lived a private little life as actually a very traditional man, very traditional family man, which sort of is very different than the early David Bowie. And when somebody asked David Bowie about this, he basically said, if one is fortunate, what they find as they go on in their life is that they become the person they were meant to be. And much to my surprise, I've become my father. David Bowie early on, David Bowie at the end of his life. Wow. And early on in his life, David Bowie says he's not a very happy person. He'd be the first one he sings all about alienation, all about loneliness, isolation. He owns right up front, he says, almost all my songs are negative. He says, but then there's a little change and they get slightly less negative. He said, and that's when I got married and had a daughter. See, that's when he kept trying to be in the forefront of everybody's attention. That's when he stopped trying to prove things. When he stopped trying to be in the forefront of everybody's attention. When he stopped trying to prove things. When he stopped trying to go with the spirit of the age and be what he thought everybody wanted to be. And he just lived this quiet little life as a father and a husband. And there he began to find something about love that began to make him happy. He began to find his heart. But I think there's so much more than that. And that's where a faith community comes in. Because it's a faith, as good as that is, that's just the start. And that's where a faith community is, because a faith community deepens and enriches our experience of connection to God and to one another. And two quick ways that I've seen that happen, and we're done. One was when we were in Belize. We went to Belize a bunch of years. We took the youth group to Belize a bunch of years ago. And the first year we met a kid named Kerwin. Kerwin was this great little Belizean. He loved his country, Belize, and he loved to show us about Belize. And so this first year, there was this river down behind this tiny little village, and he showed us how they had this rope swing that was actually really high, and this cliff they jumped off, and we all jumped. And it was just a blast. The second year, we went back to Belize, and people couldn't wait to see Kerwin again, and Kerwin couldn't wait to see us. And Kerwin found out that one of the things we wanted to do, I actually wanted to do, and a couple other people wanted to do, is we want to see an iguana. I think they called them guapo or something like that. They had some name for these. Was it guapo? Yeah, guapo. And so he took a whole bunch of us off into the woods, a bunch of young preschool, myself, went off the woods, and we looked up in this tree, and he said, there's a big iguana up there. And we looked up in this tree. This is going somewhere. Trust me, believe me, this is going somewhere. He looks up in this tree, he sees this big iguana, and he picks up an orange, and before any of us can say, what? No, don't. He takes this orange, and he goes, whoosh, And it hits the iguana like right here, and goes thunk, and the iguana just drops like a brick, straight out of the tree, boom, right on the ground. And we think, oh my goodness. But then the iguana gets up and scampers away just like it's fine. Now, why am I telling you that story? Great question. We did a lot of good work in Belize. I mean, we helped build a school so kids there wouldn't be able to go to school, would do school the second year through deforestation. It had tremendous flooding. People didn't have any food. We brought food. We gave food. We kept, families where they'd actually lost people's lives. We brought food in. We did lots of great work. But I think, to me, the thing that touched me the most was where I saw our kids developing heart. They developed a heart for something other than their iPads. Well, actually, they didn't even have iPads back then. They developed a heart for something other than just getting good grades, which, so much performance orientation in this area. Other than just the sports they play, which tends to be, about them and making their families proud. Other than just their technology, whatever the technology was at the time. Other than their ability as gamers, it gave them a heart for people just like them. And the beautiful thing that I saw in that jungle was kids from Belize and kids from America, dirt poor kids, filthy rich kids, white kids, brown kids, all of them just being kids, doing what kids do, chasing lizards. And it was my privilege to be the biggest kid of them all. You see, that's what it means to live with heart. That's Jesus' vision of the kingdom. That's Jesus' vision of the spiritual life, is people, no matter what their backgrounds, drawn together in love. And I just don't know where else you're going to find that, particularly in an election year. And then I'll give you one just a little closer to home. There is a woman in our church. She is one of the dearest women I know. It's been such a blessing to me personally. But she has gotten to be on in years, and almost all of her friends are dead, or her friends are no longer able to visit her. They're not ambulatory. There's another woman in our church who lost her mother about a year ago, and she just misses her mother so much. I mean, she misses her mother more than she misses life itself. And we've been able to put these two people together so that they're able to visit. And it's just been fantastic to watch the relationship that develops between these two, wherein one person finds her lost mom, and another person finds a friend like she hasn't had for years, so that she can call this other person up on the phone in the night and invite the other person over like at 8 o'clock at night to watch the World Series, because the older woman is a fan of baseball. And this older woman is the retirement community, and it's like the nicest community ever. I often joke with them. I say when they get to heaven, they're going to be disappointed because they have it so good there. But the older woman said to the younger woman, she said, after 15 years, I've sort of lost my taste for this food. It all tastes the same, as good as it is. It all tastes the phone. So the younger woman, on her way to visit this older, she's just inspired. She stops by McDonald's, and for $1, she buys the older woman a hamburger. And she brings the older woman a hamburger, and her eyes just light up. That's living with heart, friends. That's what a real spiritual life looks like. That's what I would wish for you, and that's what I hope you would pray for me. Amen.